One Sabbath, Jesus and his disciples were walking through a grain field. And as they went, they began to pluck handfuls of grain. The Pharisees said, "Why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did with his companions when they were hungry and in need of food? They went into the house of God, and David took the bread of the presence, which was only allowed to be eaten by the priests. And he ate some of it, and he gave the rest to his disciples. I tell you, the Sabbath is made for mankind, not mankind for the Sabbath. So the Lord, Son of Man, is ruler even of the Sabbath." He again went into the synagogue, and there was a man there with a withered hand. And the Pharisees watched to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. He said to the man, "Come forward." And the man stood in front of Jesus, and Jesus said to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to heal or to kill?" And they were silent. Jesus looked at them with anger and with deep sadness for their hardness of heart. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And as he reached out his hand, it was restored. And immediately the Pharisees went to the Herodians to plot against Jesus so that they might harm him. Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Today we enter the long season after Pentecost. It stretches from this Sunday all the way until Christ the King Sunday in November, when we begin then the new church year with Advent 1. Now, this means that we pick up with the readings that we had after Epiphany through Ash Wednesday. For those who lecture, we have about one more week of flipping back and forth the lectionary book as we did today. We also begin one of the two reading cycles for our Hebrew scripture readings. By the way, I say Hebrew scriptures, not Old Testament most of the time when I try to remember. The Hebrew scriptures are what these readings are. They are the Bible of the Jewish people. Some people hear Old Testament and think, well, they don't matter because they're old. Well, they do matter, for all of the stories of Jesus' life, like today's story, are set in a thoroughly Jewish world, and we cannot understand the setting for passages like today's gospel unless we understand Jewish theology. Now, I also have a choice of how to read the scriptures. There are two tracks which we can follow on Sunday morning. If you go to lectionary.com, by the way, that's a wonderful website where you can see what the coming readings are. You'll see that starting with today, it says track 1 or track 2. Track 2 pairs the Hebrew scriptures with the gospel, which means we jump around in the Hebrew scriptures. Track 1, which I am going to use, is what's called the continuous reading track. This means we begin the story of the prophet Samuel today, and well, his story, and then that of Saul and David and Solomon over the course of the summer. Just as last year, we heard the whole story of Abraham and his family. As a storyteller, you know that I prefer to keep the story intact rather than scattered about in bits and pieces, losing the flow of the events. It also means that in a couple of weeks, I can craft together a sermon where I take a larger look at the role of Saul. That's one of the things I plan to do. So starting this morning, though, we are back to the beginning of Mark. Now, the problem with track 1 is that the Old Testament usually doesn't have anything to do with the gospel. But I'd rather keep the stories intact. But now we're back in the Gospel of Mark. We pick up where we left at the end of Epiphany. Let's go back to the early ministry of Jesus in Mark, which is where we will be for the next several months. Remembering that we've heard the crucifixion, all the other stuff. We did that bunch of readings of John during Easter because there's no resurrection appearances in Mark, so it's tough to do Easter if you're doing Mark. So that's where we fit the appearances in John. So, little recap. I want to get you up to speed. It reminds me of when you're watching a TV series and they previously on, and they show you this, here's what happened in the previous 3 episodes or whatever. So, buckle up. Here we go. Previously in Mark, Jesus is baptized, calls Peter and Andrew along with James and John. He goes to the synagogue in Capernaum, where he casts out a demon on the Sabbath. Then he goes to Peter's house, heals Peter's mother, probably on the Sabbath. That evening, a large crowd of people arrive, and he heals many and casts out lots of demons after sundown. The next day, he heads back to Galilee to heal a leper on the road and continues to teach. Back to Capernaum, where he's teaching, and several men bring a paralyzed friend on a mat. He digs a hole in the roof, and they drop him in front of Jesus. Jesus forgives the sin and tells the man to get up and walk, and he does. Next, he calls Levi the tax collector, has dinner at his house with a bunch of other sinners, gets in an argument with the Pharisees about fasting. Then we get today's story, where Jesus and the disciples pick grain on the Sabbath. And then he does a healing in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And we're just at the beginning of chapter 3. I hope you followed all that. I did that intentionally very quickly to make the effect of just how fast things happen in the Gospel of Mark. Today's passage contains the 4th and 5th controversies in Galilee, where Jesus is going up against the norms of Jewish society. Remember, most of Mark is set in northern Israel around Galilee, Capernaum, and the Sea of Galilee and the surrounding areas, both Gentile and Jewish. He has eaten with tax collectors and sinners. He's declared the forgiveness of sins to heal a person. And the Pharisees, along with the Herodians, those are the followers of Herod Agrippa, are really upset. But as I said, we're only at the start of chapter 3. At this point, I would guess that he was very popular with many people, but the authorities are already beginning to get worried. These chapters set the stage for most of Mark's description of Jesus' life and teaching. And it's 2 major things: lots of healing and lots of controversy in the Gospel of Mark. Today we have another controversy about the Sabbath. Somebody said to me once in a Bible study, why all this argument about the Sabbath? Well, what is permitted to be done on the Sabbath is probably the most debated bit of rabbinical law then and now. Every invention or modern convenience that affects work has to have a ruling. Is it work? Is it allowed on the Sabbath? For example, some of us are old enough to remember elevator operators. I remember Bailey's department store in Lakewood, Ohio. And there was always the woman there, standing there or sitting there on her little stool with the elevator control. It was up, down, stop. And there were a couple who were really good because they always stopped right where the floor and the elevator were even. But then there were the ones that would bunch up and down a couple of times. I really dated myself. I'm sorry. Or kids that have no clue what the heck I'm talking about. No, I didn't think so. Ask your grandparents. Anyway, they came up with the modern elevator where you just got in and pushed a button. But in many high-rise buildings in cities with large Jewish populations, think in terms of New York City, even with the automatic elevator, they often would have elevator operators. Because Orthodox rabbis decided that pushing the button on the elevator was work and couldn't be done from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. I remember I lived in the Heights area of Greater Cleveland, Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights, and that is the 3rd largest Jewish population in the country outside of New York and Miami Beach. So I learned a lot about Jewish culture living there, and I remember driving up Lee Road by Cedar, and there would be a gentleman standing on the corner on Saturday morning to press the walk, don't walk button so that they could cross the street as they walked the synagogue, because they had to be close enough to walk, because driving was also considered to be work. Fun fact, the crock pot was invented by a Jewish inventor so that the meal could be prepared and put in the pot Friday night before sundown, so that when they got home from Shabbat on Saturday morning, they could have lunch. It's just an electric version of the old ceramic pot that used to sit in the corner of the fireplace and would cook their meal all night long. Now watch, everybody remember that and forget the rest of what I tell you, but oh well. In Jesus' day, there had been long-running debates about what parts of caring for animals was considered work. Was drawing water for your livestock, tying or untying them, going out to pasture was debated. If an animal got trapped in a watering hole, could you rescue them? Is it meant to save or to kill? This is the source of Jesus' question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or evil, to save life or kill lives? Remember, Jesus has not yet said the great commandment at this point in Mark. He hasn't talked about love God, love neighbor, and this is where all the law and the prophets are hanging, what they're judged on. Sin is what Jesus is defining, but it's a new concept of sin. Sin is not the breaking or keeping of individuals' laws, but what is the effect of breaking or keeping the law? Is it about love and building community, or it's just rule keeping to appease God? That's why in the Episcopal Church, we do not have a list of specific sins, but instead define sin as anything that breaks the relationship with God, with others, or with creation. Example, being a person who is always truthful is admired by many, and for most part is a good attribute. However, I've heard people say, well, to be brutally honest, in the South, that's usually prefaced with bless your heart. And then they drop some bombshell on the person, sometimes destroying that person. Now, is that really a loving thing to do? Well, maybe and maybe not. If it helps the person, then maybe it is. But if it only hurts them, well, maybe it's best not to be brutally honest. When Jesus is answering the challenge about the disciples picking grain on the Sabbath, notice, he answers in true rabbinic style with a question. This is how rabbis debated. So, if I have this question about my disciples picking grain, here's what King David did. Is that okay? He then states the Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Then he enters the synagogue, not the temple. Remember, he's in Capernaum. And the Pharisees know there's a man with a withered hand there. And that's when he asks the question about what's allowed to be done on the Sabbath. No, they do not answer his question. And Jesus is angered and grieved at their hardness of heart. Then Jesus does something really interesting. In case you didn't notice, he doesn't actually heal the man. He simply says, stretch out your hand. And as he stretched out his hand, it was restored. Which I imagine left the Pharisees with a bit of a problem. But it didn't stop them from going after him. The message, though, is in our world, I would hope that we agree that healing someone, saving someone's life, restoring their full health is a wonderful thing no matter when it's done. The message I want us all to focus on is that rules are made for the benefit of people. Sometimes exceptions need to be made. Sometimes enforcing a rule blindly can itself be a sin. I think that the key is that Jesus is grieved at their hardness of heart. We can follow the rules perfectly and still be guilty of hardness of heart. Hardness of heart for Jesus is the sin of the Pharisees. For Jesus, once again, it's about love and the love that is in our heart that he calls us to show, that God and Jesus give us, that I've been talking about for the last several weeks. So when faced with a difficult decision, I try, don't always succeed, but I always try to act with a heart filled with love, not one hardened by rules. It's messy, it's complicated, but I encourage you to do the same thing. Amen.
just for the perspective. Thank you so much. Thank you. Just a few, because I'm not going to be three. I can give two, so that's see, I'm going to stop the restroom real quick, and I'll meet you downstairs and go downstairs.
Okay.
And Sally, talked to Rosanna for me, which is very sweet. And I just gave her some money to get some tomatoes from her, so she'll be this.